I want to tell you about a decision I made back in the 1950s that taught me something important about cash. I was in my early 20s, just getting started, and I'd saved up a few $1,000s. My father, who was a stockbroker and a congressman, suggested I keep most of it in savings bonds. They were paying around 2.5% at the time, which seemed reasonable. Safe, steady, patriotic even. But I did something that probably seemed reckless to him. I put almost everything into stocks of businesses I'd studied carefully. Companies selling below what I calculated they were worth. And over the next few years, that decision made all the difference. Not because I was smarter than my father, he was a very intelligent man, but because I understood something about what cash really represents. Cash is a claim on future goods and services. That's all it is. And the value of that claim erodes every single day that prices are rising. When you hold cash or near cash equivalents like savings accounts or money market funds, you're making an active decision to accept that erosion in exchange for liquidity and safety. Sometimes that's the right trade. Often it's not. Let me walk you through why this matters more today than it has in a long time, and why the conventional wisdom about keeping substantial savings is worth rethinking. I'm not talking about your emergency fund or money you'll need in the next year or two. That should be in cash, absolutely. I'm talking about larger pools of money that people leave sitting in savings accounts for years, sometimes decades, thinking they're being prudent. Here's the reality. If you have $50,000 in a savings account earning, let's say, 4% interest, you're getting $2,000 a year. That sounds fine until you consider that inflation over the past few years has been running at 3, 4, sometimes 5% or more. Even if we assume it settles back down to 3%, your $50,000 is losing purchasing power. After taxes on that interest, which you owe even though you're not really gaining anything in real terms, you might be going backwards by $1,000 or more annually. Now multiply that over 10 years. Your $50,000 might grow to around $60,000 with compounding interest. But if inflation averaged 3%, you'd need about $67,000 just to have the same purchasing power you started with. You've worked, you've saved, you've been responsible, and you're worse off than when you began. I've watched this happen to people I care about. A cousin of mine inherited about $200,000 back in the early 2000s. She was nervous about investing, afraid of losing it, so she put it all in certificates of deposit and savings accounts, safe, guaranteed, FDIC insured. 20 years later, that $200,000 had grown to maybe $280,000 with interest. Sounds like a win, right? But here's what actually happened. In those 20 years, the cost of everything she needed doubled or more. Her healthcare expenses, her rent, groceries, utilities, all of it. That $280,000 bought less than the original $200,000 did when she inherited it. She'd preserved the dollars but lost the wealth. And there's no way to get those 20 years back. That's the invisible tax nobody talks about. You feel like you're being safe, and in one sense you are. Your principal isn't fluctuating, but you're paying a penalty every year for that feeling of safety, and it compounds against you just as surely as interest compounds for you. Now, I can already hear the objections. What about the risk of stocks? What about market crashes? What about losing everything? These are fair questions, and they deserve serious answers, not dismissive ones. The truth is, stocks do go down, sometimes dramatically. In 2008, the market fell by more than half. In 2020, it dropped by a third in a matter of weeks. If you had money in stocks during those times and you needed to sell, you would have crystallized real losses. That's not theoretical. It happens. But here's what you need to understand. Those crashes, as scary as they are temporary if you're invested in sound businesses. Every single market crash in history has eventually recovered. Every single one. And the businesses that survived, the good ones with real competitive advantages and competent management, came back stronger. The people who lost money permanently were the ones who sold at the bottom, who let fear override their long-term thinking. Compare that to inflation. Inflation doesn't crash and recover. It grinds away day after day, year after year. It's permanent erosion. You don't get that purchasing power back. The person who kept their money in cash during those market crashes might have avoided the temporary decline, but they guaranteed themselves a permanent loss in real terms. Let me give you a specific example with numbers. Suppose two people each had $100,000 in January of 2000. Person A put it all in a broad stock index fund. Person B put it all in savings accounts and CDs. Over the next 23 years, person A's investment went through two major crashes and numerous smaller declines. There were years when their account was worth $80,000 or even $70,000. Frightening. But by 2023, despite all that volatility, person A's $100,000 had grown to somewhere around $400,000, maybe more, depending on exact timing. Person B, meanwhile, earned steady interest the whole time, never saw their balance decline, and ended up with maybe $170,000. 400,000 versus 170,000. That's not a small difference. That's life-changing. That's the difference between a comfortable retirement and a stressful one. And remember, this includes two of the worst market crashes in modern history. Now, here's the part people miss. Person A didn't need nerves of steel to achieve that outcome. They just needed to not look at their account during the crashes and not sell. If you're holding a business that you believe in, that's generating earnings and paying dividends, a temporary decline in the quoted price is just noise. It's Mr. Market being irrational. It has nothing to do with your actual long-term returns. I remember in 2008, Berkshire's stock price fell significantly along with everything else. People asked me if I was worried. The answer was no, not at all. The businesses we owned, the insurance companies, the manufacturers, the utilities, they were still operating. They were still generating cash. The stock price was just a number on a screen reflecting widespread panic. It had no bearing on the underlying value of what we owned. If you can internalize that idea that temporary price declines are irrelevant if you're not forced to sell, then you can hold stocks through anything. And if you can hold stocks through anything, then keeping large amounts in savings accounts becomes very hard to justify. But let's talk about the situation where savings might make sense, because I don't want to be dogmatic about this. If you're saving for a down payment on a house and you'll need the money in a year, absolutely keep it in savings. If you're building an emergency fund to cover unexpected expenses, that belongs in cash. If you're retired and you need steady income to pay your bills, having a year or two of expenses in liquid, stable accounts is smart planning. The problem is when people extend that logic too far. They think that because some cash is good, more cash is better. Or they're so afraid of volatility that they keep the majority of their assets in cash, even though they won't need the money for years or even decades. That's when savings stops being prudent and starts being destructive. I knew a man who worked in manufacturing his whole career. Steady job, modest lifestyle, saved diligently. By the time he was in his 40s, he'd accumulated nearly $300,000. All of it sitting in savings accounts and short-term bonds earning minimal interest. He told me once that he couldn't stand the thought of losing it, that he'd worked too hard for that money to risk it in the stock market. I tried to explain to him that he was losing it anyway, just slowly, but he couldn't see it. To him, the balance in his account kept growing, and that felt like winning. It took about 15 years before he started to realize that his $300,000 wasn't going as far as it used to. By then, he'd missed out on what could have been $700,000 or $800,000 if he just put some of it into businesses. That's the tragedy of excessive savings. It's not dramatic. There's no moment where you lose everything. It's just a slow fade, a gradual diminishment of your future possibilities. And by the time you realize what's happened, you've lost something you can never recover, which is time. Time is the one asset that truly compounds. Einstein supposedly said compound interest is the most powerful force in the universe, though I'm not sure he actually said that. But whether he did or not, the idea is right. When you're young, time is your greatest advantage. When you're older, it's your scarcest resource. And when you keep money in savings for long periods, you're essentially throwing away time. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine you're offered a job where you'll be paid $100,000 a year, but every year inflation reduces your salary by 3% in real terms. So year one, you make $100,000. Year two, you make $97,000 in purchasing power. Year three, you make $94,000. By year 10, you're effectively making about $74,000, even though your paycheck still says $100,000. Would you take that job? Probably not, unless you had no other options. Yet that's exactly what you're doing when you hold savings long term. You're accepting a guaranteed pay cut every single year in exchange for the comfort of stability. Now, there's a counter argument I should address. Some people will say that savings accounts are better than nothing, and for people who truly can't tolerate any volatility, cash is the only option they'll stick with. And there's some truth to that. An imperfect plan that you'll follow is better than a perfect plan that you'll abandon. But I think that sells people short. Most people are more capable of handling volatility than they think. What they need is education and proper structure, not capitulation to their fears. If you set up your finances correctly, with appropriate cash reserves and a clear understanding of what you own and why, you can handle market downturns just fine. The key is never being forced to sell. That's the whole game right there. If you have enough cash for emergencies and near-term needs, then the swings in your stock portfolio are just numbers on paper. They don't affect your life. You can ignore them. And if you can ignore them, they stop being scary. I'll share something that might surprise you. Berkshire holds a lot of cash sometimes, tens of billions of dollars. People ask why. If cash is such a bad investment, why do we hold so much of it? The answer is simple. We hold cash because we're waiting for opportunities to deploy it into businesses at attractive prices. It's not a permanent allocation. It's temporary patience for an individual. The equivalent might be holding extra cash because you're planning to buy a rental property or start a business or make some other investment where you'll need liquidity. That's fine. That's strategic. But holding cash indefinitely because you're afraid or because you haven't thought through what else to do with it, that's different. That's corrosive. Let me tell you what I think people should do instead. Take your savings and divide it into 3 buckets. Bucket 1 is your emergency fund, maybe 6 months to a year of expenses. That stays in cash, completely liquid, no questions asked. Bucket 2 is money you'll need in the next 2 to 5 years for specific purposes. That might stay in cash or go into very short-term bonds, depending on your comfort level. Bucket 3 is everything else, money you won't need for at least 5 years, probably longer. Bucket 3 should not be in savings. It should be invested in businesses, real productive assets that generate earnings and can grow over time. You can do this through individual stocks if you're willing to do the research, or through low-cost index funds if you want a simpler approach. Either way works. The important thing is getting that money out of cash and into something that can actually compound. Now, what about the risk? What if the market crashes right after you invest? It's possible, and you need to be prepared for it emotionally. But here's the thing. If you're investing money you won't need for 5 or 10 or 20 years, a crash in year 1 is actually good for you. It means you're buying at lower prices, which sets you up for better returns down the road. The only way a crash hurts you permanently is if you sell during it. And you won't need to sell if you've structured things correctly with enough cash in buckets 1 and 2. See how it all fits together? The cash reserves aren't there because stocks are dangerous. They're there so you can own stocks safely. I think about this with young people especially. I see college graduates with $10,000 or $20,000 in savings, which is great. They worked hard for that money. But then they leave it sitting in a bank account earning almost nothing because they're nervous about investing. And I want to tell them, you're 23 or 25 years old. You have 40 years until retirement, 40 years for compounding to work. If you invest that $20,000 in good businesses and earn, say, 10% annually, which is roughly the market's long-term average, that $20,000 becomes about $900,000 by retirement. But if you leave it in savings, earning 3% after tax and inflation, it might grow to maybe $35,000 or $40,000 in real terms. You've taken your most precious asset, which is time, and you've squandered it for the illusion of safety. That breaks my heart because it's so unnecessary. Of course, not everyone is 25. If you're 50 or 60, the calculation changes somewhat. You have less time to recover from mistakes, less time for compounding to work. But even then, if you've got money you won't need for 10 or 15 years, it should probably be invested rather than sitting in savings. The principles don't change that much. You just might want a bit more in bucket 1 and bucket 2 for security. The other thing I'd say is this. Don't confuse savings accounts with safety. Real safety comes from owning assets that maintain their value in real terms, not nominal terms. A savings account protects your dollars. It doesn't protect your wealth. And ultimately, it's wealth you care about, not dollars. Think about what you can buy with your money, not what the number in your account says. That's the measure that matters. Can you afford the same lifestyle in 10 years that you can today? Can you handle unexpected expenses without financial stress? Can you help your kids or grandkids if they need it? Those are the questions that determine whether you're actually safe. I've been thinking about this a lot lately because I see people making the same mistakes I saw folks make back in the 50s and 60s. The specific numbers are different. Inflation rates change, interest rates move around, but the fundamental error is the same. People optimize for feeling safe rather than being safe. They want to see a stable account balance, and they sacrifice their long-term financial security to get it. It doesn't have to be that way. You can structure your finances to give you both stability and growth. You can sleep well at night knowing you're prepared for emergencies, while also building real wealth over time. But you have to be willing to think clearly about what risk actually means and accept that volatility is not the same thing as danger. There's another aspect to this that doesn't get discussed enough. When you keep money in savings for long periods, you're not just losing to inflation, you're also losing the psychological benefit of seeing your wealth actually grow. I know that sounds backwards, since your savings account balance does go up. But watching a number increase while your purchasing power decreases is actually demoralizing once you understand what's happening. It's like running on a treadmill and thinking you're making progress toward a destination. Compare that to owning businesses. Yes, the value fluctuates. Yes, there are down years. But over time, if you own good companies, you're building something real. You're participating in economic growth. You're aligned with human progress and innovation. There's something satisfying about that, something that goes beyond just the numbers. I remember talking to a young woman a few years back who'd saved about $30,000 by her late 20s. She was proud of that savings, and she should have been. But she was also frustrated because she felt like she wasn't getting anywhere financially, and the balance crept up slowly, but she didn't feel wealthier. I suggested she think about investing some of it. Not all of it, she should keep an emergency fund, but maybe $15,000 or $20,000 into a mix of solid companies. She was nervous, but eventually did it. A few years later, she told me it was one of the best decisions she made. Not because the returns were spectacular, they were fine, but not amazing, but because she felt like she was actually building wealth rather than just warehousing money. That psychological shift matters more than people realize. When you're actively investing, you start paying attention to businesses, to how the economy works, to what creates value. You become more financially literate almost by necessity. When you just keep money in savings, you don't learn anything. You're passive, and that passivity extends to how you think about money more broadly. Now, I need to address something that's probably on your mind. What about the people who invested right before a crash and lost a lot of money? What about the stories of retirement accounts getting cut in half? Those are real, and they're painful. But here's what usually happened in those situations. Either the person panicked and sold at the bottom, turning a temporary decline into a permanent loss, or they were invested in things they didn't understand, speculative stocks or complex financial products that genuinely did lose value permanently. Very rarely was it a case of someone holding a diversified portfolio of good businesses through the downturn and still ending up worse off years later. The key is time horizon and emotional preparation. If you know going in that your investments might drop by 30 or 40 or even 50% at some point, and you've structured your life so you can ride that out, then it's just part of the process. But if you're surprised by volatility, if you think stocks only go up, or if you need the money next year, then yes, you can get hurt. That's why the 3-bucket approach matters so much. You're not putting rent money in stocks. You're not putting next year's tuition in stocks. You're putting long-term money in stocks, money that has time to compound and recover from whatever the market throws at it. The structure protects you from your own potential panic. Here's another consideration that people overlook: the tax treatment of savings versus investments. Interest from savings accounts is taxed as ordinary income at your full tax rate. If you're in a 22% bracket and you earn 4% interest, your after-tax return is closer to 3%. After inflation, you might be breaking even or even losing ground. Contrast that with long-term investments in stocks. If you hold for more than a year, your gains are taxed at the lower capital gains rate, often 15 or 20% instead of your ordinary income rate. And you only pay tax when you sell, so the money compounds tax deferred while you hold it. That's a significant advantage that makes the real return difference even larger than it first appears. I'm not a tax advisor, and everyone's situation is different, so you should consult with a professional about your specific circumstances. But the general principle holds. The tax code is set up to reward long-term investing over short-term saving. That's not an accident. It's policy designed to encourage capital formation and economic growth. You might as well take advantage of it. Let me give you one more example to drive this home. Imagine 3 siblings, each inheriting $100,000 from their grandmother. Sibling 1 puts it all in savings. Sibling 2 spends it on a new car and a fancy vacation. Sibling 3 invested in a portfolio of businesses. 20 years later, sibling 1 has maybe $160,000, but in real purchasing power, it's worth less than the original $100,000. Sibling 2 has nothing. The car is long gone and the vacation is a memory. Sibling 3 has somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000, depending on how the investments performed. And in real terms, that's significantly wealthier than the starting point. Who honored their grandmother's gift? Who used the money in a way that actually built something lasting? I'd argue it's sibling 3, even though sibling 1 might feel like they were being more responsible by keeping it safe. This isn't just about money, though money is part of it. It's about how you think about the future and what you're trying to accomplish with the resources you have. If your goal is just to not lose the nominal dollar amount, then sure, savings accounts work. But if your goal is to build financial security, to create options for yourself and your family, to maintain your standard of living as you age, then you need something that actually grows in real terms. I'm not suggesting you do anything reckless. I'm not telling you to put your emergency fund in cryptocurrency or speculative stocks or anything crazy. I'm simply saying that if you have significant savings sitting in cash for years on end, you're accepting a guaranteed loss in exchange for a false sense of security. And there are better options available to you, options that might feel less comfortable in the short term, but will serve you much better over the years and decades ahead. This might not be what you want to hear if you've got a substantial amount in savings right now and you felt good about that decision. But I'd rather give you honest perspective than tell you what's comfortable. The truth is, inflation is real, it's persistent, and it will erode your purchasing power whether you acknowledge it or not. The only question is whether you're going to position yourself to offset that erosion or accept it as inevitable. I think about the people who came of age during the Depression or immediately after World War II. Many of them developed a deep mistrust of the stock market, and I understand why. They saw real devastation. But many of them also missed out on decades of wealth creation because they couldn't let go of that fear. They kept everything in cash and bonds and watched as younger generations who were willing to invest built substantial wealth. History doesn't repeat perfectly, but it often rhymes. The lesson isn't that you should ignore risk. It's that you should understand what the real risks are and position yourself accordingly. Keeping too much in savings feels safe, but it's often the riskiest choice of all when you look at the long term. I know which choice I'd make, and I know which choice I'd encourage anyone I cared about to make, not with all their money, not recklessly, but thoughtfully and with proper structure. Because at the end of the day, money sitting in a savings account isn't working for you. It's slowly dying, and you deserve better than that.